The moment it began unraveling did not look dramatic from the outside. It looked polished, elegant, almost celebratory. My name is Adrian Vale. I am 52 years old, a commercial litigation strategist who built a career on anticipating collapse before it happened. For 25 years, I had advised corporations on how to survive hostile negotiations, how to shield themselves from unseen liabilities, how to read silence in a room as clearly as spoken threat. Yet the night my own marriage fractured, I stood beneath cascading crystal lights in a waterfront hotel ballroom and failed to read what was directly in front of me. My wife, Serafina, stood near the center of the room in a tailored emerald dress, laughter floating easily from her lips as colleagues circled her like planets around a rising star. She had spent nearly a decade climbing the hierarchy at Helix Dynamics, moving from analyst to executive director with relentless precision. I had admired her ambition once. I had even defended it when friends muttered that she was married more to her calendar than to me. That evening was another corporate gala celebrating unprecedented quarterly returns, the kind of function where champagne flowed without pause and compliments were traded like currency. I stood near the bar nursing mineral water instead of whiskey, watching her navigate conversations with that sharp intelligence that once made me feel chosen. Then her superior, a man named Garrick Rowan, approached her, tall, impeccably groomed, radiating that cultivated authority executives mistake for charisma. He leaned close, too close. I could not hear the first exchange, but I saw the subtle tilt of her head, the receptive smile. Then he turned his gaze deliberately toward me across the crowded floor. "Dinner tomorrow evening," he said clearly enough for the distance to vanish. "Just us. We'll discuss your next step." It was not a private invitation. It was a declaration, and she said yes. She did not hesitate. She did not look conflicted. She glanced at me for the briefest second, not long enough to measure my reaction, just long enough to acknowledge my presence before dismissing it. "That would be wonderful," she replied, warmth coating her tone. In that instant, something in me did not break loudly. It dissolved quietly. Garrick maintained eye contact with me when she accepted, a subtle assertion of hierarchy that had nothing to do with business. I could have interrupted. I could have crossed the room, asserted boundaries, demanded explanation. Instead, I placed my untouched glass on a silver tray and walked out without a word. The marble corridor outside the ballroom amplified my footsteps in a way that felt ceremonial, as if the building itself were marking the end of something. No one followed. No one called after me. I reached the parking structure and sat inside my car with the engine off, hands resting loosely on the steering wheel. There was no shouting in my mind, no rage, only clarity. I replayed not just that moment, but years of smaller dismissals, conversations cut short because of conference calls, anniversaries negotiated around quarterly reports, evenings where my presence felt incidental. The dinner invitation had not created the fracture, it had exposed it. She had chosen alignment with power over alignment with partnership, and she had done so publicly. That mattered more than the dinner itself. When my phone vibrated with her message asking where I had gone, I did not respond. I drove home to the meticulously landscaped suburb we inhabited, where every driveway held polished vehicles and every porch light suggested domestic stability. I parked, but I did not immediately step inside. I sat in the darkened garage listening to the cooling engine tick, and I made a decision not rooted in impulse but in assessment. Over the previous year, I had quietly begun reevaluating my life, not because I anticipated betrayal but because I sensed absence. We had grown into parallel lines, functioning, efficient, distant. I had initiated conversations about counseling, about recalibrating priorities, about carving out protected time together. Each attempt had been deferred to a later date that never arrived. So I had shifted inward, restructuring my professional commitments, diversifying investments, simplifying obligations. Nothing dramatic, nothing secretive, just preparation for independence should the need arise. That night in the garage, I understood that the contingency had become reality. If she returned and behaved as though nothing significant had occurred, then I would know definitively that I had become background architecture in her life. When she came home past midnight, her footsteps echoing across tile. She called my name twice in a casual tone. I remained in my office with the lights dimmed, listening. She did not knock on the door. She went upstairs. The following morning I rose before dawn, packed a modest travel bag, and left it by the front entrance. On the kitchen counter I placed my house keys and a single envelope containing documents outlining my decision to separate finances and initiate dissolution proceedings. Not accusations, not threats, just formal notice. I walked through the room slowly, absorbing details I had once believed permanent. The dining table where we had hosted colleagues, the hallway where framed photographs chronicled decades. Memory did not anchor me anymore, it instructed me. By sunrise, I exited the house and did not look back. I drove south along the coastal highway without a defined destination, only a need for distance. I had already arranged extended leave from my firm months earlier under the pretense of research sabbatical. That time would now serve a different purpose. I booked a modest inn in a seaside town known more for fishing docks than tourism, paid in advance, and allowed anonymity to settle around me like fog. In that small room overlooking gray water, I monitored the inevitable unraveling from afar, not obsessively but pragmatically. Messages accumulated. Calls from her, from mutual acquaintances, from a concerned associate at my firm. I responded only to essential professional inquiries and informed my partners of an extended absence. By the second week, legal counsel representing Serafina reached out proposing negotiation. I retained my own attorney, an old colleague named Malcolm Dre, whose calm competence had steadied me in past corporate battles. "Are you certain?" he asked during our first consultation. "Once you formalize this, there's no retreat." I told him I had been retreating for years in increments too small to notice. This was not escalation, it was cessation. Meanwhile, I learned that Helix Dynamics faced mounting regulatory scrutiny tied to a pending merger Garrick had championed. Industry analysts speculated about over-evaluation and compliance oversights. I did not celebrate the turbulence, I simply observed it. For the first time in years, my emotional energy was not spent anticipating her schedule or accommodating her ambitions. It was redirected toward understanding who I was when not positioned in her shadow. Our daughter Linnea became the axis of my internal conflict. At 24, she had recently relocated to another state to begin her own career. I had spoken with her days before the gala, sensing distance but unwilling to burden her with marital strain. Now she called repeatedly, confusion evident in her voice. I answered on the fourth attempt. "I'm safe," I assured her before she could ask. I needed space. She told me her mother described the separation as abrupt, as disproportionate to a simple dinner invitation. I did not counterattack. Instead, I described patterns, years of deferred intimacy, moments of public dismissal, attempts at repair that dissolved into scheduling conflicts. "This isn't about one evening," I said. "It's about being unseen for a long time." Linnea was quiet. "I wish you'd both told me sooner," she replied. I did too. In the weeks that followed, she navigated conversations with each of us separately, attempting neutrality. I refused to recruit her as an ally. Whatever grievance existed between her mother and me would not be weaponized through our child. Yet it pained me to hear the strain in her tone when corporate instability threatened her mother's position. Garrick's strategic gamble faltered publicly. Shareholder confidence dipped. Leadership restructuring loomed. Serafina, once insulated by upward momentum, suddenly faced vulnerability. For years I had been the stable counterweight to her volatility. Now she confronted consequences without my quiet reinforcement. 3 months into my self-imposed exile, I rented a small cabin inland surrounded by cedar and mist. The owner, an elderly widower named Henrik, asked few questions beyond payment schedule. The isolation was not punishment, it was recalibration. I woke early, ran along gravel roads, read philosophy instead of financial reports. I began journaling, not about betrayal, but about identity. I examined why I had tolerated incremental invisibility. I had mistaken patience for resilience, silence for maturity. In professional settings, my restraint signaled strength. In marriage, it had become permission for erasure. Meanwhile, public discourse around corporate ethics intensified as Helix Dynamics announced leadership turnover. Garrick resigned amid shareholder pressure. Serafina's position shifted from executive authority to interim consultant as restructuring unfolded. Friends forwarded articles to me, assuming schadenfreude. They misunderstood. I felt no triumph. Collapse, even when predictable, carries collateral damage. My focus remained inward. Malcolm updated me on divorce proceedings progressing methodically. There was negotiation, yes, but not warfare. We disentangled assets, responsibilities, obligations. Each document signed represented not conquest but closure. When Serafina requested a face-to-face meeting, I agreed on neutral ground months later, not because I wavered, but because unfinished dialogue corrodes from within. We met in a public botanical garden halfway between our respective cities. She appeared diminished not physically but energetically, as though relentless acceleration had finally stalled. We sat across from each other on a wrought iron bench framed by late summer blooms. "I underestimated you," she began without preamble. "I thought you argue or threaten or eventually forgive. I didn't think you'd leave." I told her leaving had been the last conversation I knew how to have. She insisted the dinner had been strategic, harmless, necessary for advancement. I acknowledged that perhaps it had been. But the way it was offered and accepted reduced our partnership to an afterthought, I said. That wasn't new, it was just undeniable. For the first time in years, she did not counter with logic. She admitted she had conflated professional validation with self-worth, that she had treated our marriage as infrastructure, assumed, stable, self-sustaining. Apology emerged not defensive but raw. Hearing it stirred neither reconciliation nor bitterness. It produced recognition. We had both participated in drift, though differently. By the end of the conversation, there was no dramatic reconciliation, only mutual acknowledgement that the life we had built no longer fit the people we had become. We signed final documents weeks later without spectacle. 6 months after the gala, a journalist contacted me requesting commentary on executive culture and relational strain among high-performing professionals. My situation had circulated anonymously in online discussions, reframed as either strategic empowerment or emotional abandonment. I declined interviews initially, wary of becoming caricature. Yet the narrative being constructed by strangers felt incomplete. I agreed eventually to contribute an essay to a legal ethics journal, not about my marriage specifically, but about the intersection of ambition, identity, and neglect. The response was overwhelming. Letters arrived from men and women describing years of feeling peripheral in their own relationships. Some praised my decisiveness, others criticized my departure. I realized the story resonated because invisibility is rarely dramatic. It accrues quietly. Encouraged by colleagues, I began expanding the essay into a manuscript exploring boundaries, communication failures, and the courage required to confront erosion before it becomes collapse. Writing demanded honesty. I documented not only her omissions but my own avoidance, my reliance on strategic thinking instead of vulnerable confrontation. Publication did not transform me into hero or villain. It positioned me as witness to a dynamic many recognized but seldom articulated. As my manuscript moved toward release, Linnea visited the cabin for the first time. She walked the perimeter silently, absorbing the simplicity of my new life. "You seem lighter," she observed over tea. I told her clarity weighs less than resentment. She shared that her mother had entered therapy, that corporate downsizing forced reevaluation, that humility had replaced bravado. "She's not who she was," Linnea said. I believed that. Loss can recalibrate values faster than success ever could. I asked my daughter what she needed from me moving forward. "Consistency," she answered without hesitation. "Not strategy, not distance, just presence." That word struck deeper than any accusation. Presence. It had been what I sought and what I must now offer. The book launched modestly but steadily, not as exposé but as reflection. Some reviewers applauded its nuance, others wanted sharper condemnation. I resisted simplifying complexity. Marriages seldom fracture because of singular events. They erode when attention is rationed and appreciation assumed. If my departure symbolized anything, it was not vengeance. It was the refusal to continue negotiating for basic visibility. Nearly a year after that night in the ballroom, I returned to the city for a professional symposium. Walking past the same hotel, I paused briefly beneath its facade. The chandeliers still glittered inside. Other couples navigated ambition and affection in that space. I felt neither anger nor nostalgia. I felt gratitude for the rupture that forced confrontation. Serafina and I exchanged occasional civil messages regarding Linnea and mutual acquaintances. There was no rekindled romance, but there was measured respect. We had dismantled a shared life without annihilating each other. I had learned that strategic withdrawal, when rooted in clarity rather than spite, can create space for reinvention. She had learned that success purchased at the expense of intimacy yields hollow dividends. As I drove back toward the cedar-lined road leading to the cabin, I understood that the true transformation had not occurred the moment she accepted a dinner invitation. It occurred the moment I recognized my own diminishing outline and chose to redraw it. I did not vanish to punish. I stepped away to reappear on my own terms, visible first to myself, then to the world willing to see. The year following our final signatures unfolded not with fireworks but with deliberate quiet. The manuscript that had begun as private notes became a published volume titled The Architecture of Absence, and while it did not explode into sensational headlines, it circulated steadily through book clubs, professional circles, and therapy practices. Invitations arrived, panels on workplace culture, discussions about relational neglect among high achievers, interviews with hosts who wanted sharp sound bites. I refused to reduce the story into slogans. I spoke instead about incremental erosion, about how invisibility rarely announces itself. It accumulates in postponed conversations and polite compromises. The more I articulated it publicly, the more I recognized how complicit I had been in my own silence. I had mistaken endurance for virtue. In truth, I had feared conflict more than erasure. During one symposium in Chicago, a young associate approached me afterward and said, "You left before you hated her. That's what scares me." His comment lingered. Leaving before hatred calcifies is not dramatic, it is preventative. Many wait until contempt replaces disappointment, until words become weapons. I had left when clarity arrived, not because I despised Serafina, but because I could see the trajectory. That nuance was often lost in commentary, but it mattered deeply to me. Meanwhile, Serafina's reinvention unfolded quietly as well. Through Linnea, I learned she had taken a position with a regional nonprofit focused on ethical corporate reform, a significant departure from her previous executive track. The salary was modest compared to what she once commanded, but the stability appeared grounding rather than limiting. When we met occasionally to discuss family logistics, I noticed a difference in her demeanor. She listened longer. She did not glance at her phone mid-sentence. She spoke about projects with purpose rather than prestige. During one such meeting at a modest cafe near the riverfront, she said, "I thought acceleration meant security. I didn't realize it was avoidance." I understood what she meant. Ambition can be both engine and escape. We discussed nothing romantic, nothing nostalgic. Instead, we acknowledged the strange gratitude that can coexist with loss. Without the rupture, neither of us would have examined our habits so ruthlessly. That does not make the pain necessary, but it renders it instructive. When we parted that afternoon, there was no lingering tension, only the quiet recognition that we had transitioned from spouses to something more distant but more honest. Henrik, the cabin owner, suffered a stroke late that autumn. I spent evenings at the small regional hospital, sitting with him while nurses adjusted monitors and winter pressed against the windows. He spoke sparingly, but one evening he said, "You didn't come here to hide, you came here to listen." I asked him what he meant. He gestured weakly toward my chest. "Most men your age don't listen until something inside them collapses. You listened before that." His words unsettled me. Had I? Or had I simply reacted faster than usual? Reflection revealed that the seeds of departure had been planted long before the gala, subtle discomforts, unmet needs I had dismissed as temporary. Listening required courage because it threatened stability. I had finally allowed discomfort to speak. When Henrik passed peacefully weeks later, I attended a small memorial in the town hall. His daughter thanked me for being present during his final days. Presence again, that word circled my life like a refrain. It had become both lesson and measure. I resolved not to romanticize solitude. Isolation had served its purpose. Community would now test my growth. 2 years after the separation, I accepted a visiting lectureship at a coastal university known for integrating ethics into business curriculum. Standing before students who were younger than my marriage had been when it began, I spoke about contracts not merely as legal instruments but as reflections of values. Every agreement, I told them, reveals priorities. The absence of explicit terms can be as telling as the clauses included. After class, several lingered to ask about balancing ambition with relationships. I did not prescribe formulas. I asked them instead what success meant absent applause. The conversations invigorated me. Teaching required vulnerability different from writing. It demanded responsiveness in real time. I found myself sharing more about missteps than achievements. In doing so, I dismantled the illusion that departure equaled mastery. It equaled decision. Mastery required continuous self-examination. On evenings when campus quieted, I walked along the cliffs overlooking the ocean, aware that the rhythm of waves felt steadier than any corporate quarter. Stability, I realized, was internal alignment rather than external recognition. Linnea eventually decided to move closer to the university, accepting a role in urban planning that aligned with her environmental interests. We began a weekly ritual, Sunday breakfasts at a small bakery where the owner greeted us by name. These mornings contained none of the guardedness that once defined our family dinners. She asked direct questions about my loneliness, about whether I regretted not fighting harder. I answered honestly. I regretted not speaking earlier, but I did not regret leaving when I did. "Do you think you'll marry again?" she asked one morning, sunlight catching in her hair. I considered the question carefully. "If I do," I said, "it will be with someone who understands that presence is not negotiable." She nodded thoughtfully. Watching her construct relationships with deliberate attentiveness reassured me that generational patterns are not destiny. She had observed our drift and chosen differently. That knowledge softened any lingering guilt I carried. Serafina and I met once more at Linnea's request during a family holiday gathering. It was not dramatic, just a shared table, careful conversation, cautious laughter. At one point, while clearing dishes together in the kitchen, Serafina said quietly, "I used to think your silence meant compliance. Now I understand it meant disappointment," I replied. "And I used to think your drive meant indifference. Now I see it masked fear." We did not attempt to rewrite history. We simply acknowledged complexity. That evening, as I drove back to the coast, I felt an unexpected lightness. Closure is often depicted as a single conversation. In reality, it accumulates through repeated civility. We had reached a place where neither of us needed to win the narrative. That release allowed space for something new, not reconciliation between us, but renewal within ourselves. Opportunities expanded beyond academia. Organizations invited me to consult on leadership culture, specifically on fostering environments where professional ambition does not eclipse relational accountability. I hesitated at first, wary of commodifying personal pain. Yet I realized that experience, when distilled thoughtfully, can serve collective growth. During one corporate retreat in Seattle, I facilitated a session asking executives to list relationships neglected in pursuit of quarterly targets. The room fell uncomfortably silent as pens hovered over paper. One participant later confided, "I recognize myself in your story more than I expected." I told him recognition is only valuable if it leads to action. Whether he acted, I cannot say, but the willingness to confront imbalance felt significant. Each workshop reinforced that my departure was not an isolated anecdote. It reflected systemic patterns where productivity eclipses presence. In the third year after the gala, I began drafting a second book, not about separation but about reconstruction. I titled it After the Quiet. It explored how identity must be rebuilt intentionally once familiar roles dissolve. Writing it required confronting residual pride. I had been celebrated by some as decisive, by others condemned as detached. Neither portrayal captured the full truth. I was a man who had grown tired of waiting to be prioritized. I was also a man who had delayed confrontation too long. Accepting both realities prevented sanctimony. As drafts progressed, I incorporated interviews with therapists, sociologists, and business leaders to contextualize personal narrative within broader trends. The work felt less like catharsis and more like contribution. I no longer wrote to justify my exit. I wrote to illuminate pathways toward earlier intervention, toward conversations held before departure becomes necessary. One autumn afternoon, nearly 3 years after everything shifted, I returned alone to the waterfront hotel where the fracture first became visible. I booked a quiet room, not for nostalgia but for examination. Standing once more beneath crystal lights, I watched another corporate celebration unfold. A couple stood near the bar, tension etched subtly between them while colleagues applauded an executive speech. I did not intrude. I simply observed with heightened awareness. The environment had not changed, I had. I understood now that the dinner invitation had not been an act of seduction but of testing boundaries, hierarchies, loyalties. My response had been unconventional but authentic. I left the ballroom before speeches concluded and walked along the harbor until midnight. The city shimmered as it had years earlier, indifferent to individual dramas. I felt neither regret nor triumph, only steadiness. As I approached my mid-50s, I recognized that reinvention is less about dramatic transformation and more about sustained alignment. I maintained friendships more intentionally, scheduling time not as obligation but as commitment. I pursued hobbies long deferred, restoring a small sailboat, learning classical guitar, volunteering at a legal aid clinic assisting individuals navigating complex separations without resources. Each activity reinforced that identity cannot rest solely on professional or relational roles. It must anchor in values practiced daily. Occasionally, public interest in my story resurfaced through podcasts or articles, but I no longer felt compelled to correct interpretations. The narrative belonged partly to the public now, yet its core remained mine. I knew why I left. I knew what I learned. That sufficed. On the 4th anniversary of the gala, Linnea and I hiked a coastal trail overlooking cliffs carved by relentless waves. At the summit she paused and said, "You're different from the man who stood at my graduation." I asked how. "You're softer," she replied, "but also clearer." I accepted the description. Softness no longer equated to weakness. Clarity no longer required rigidity. I had learned that self-respect and compassion can coexist. As we descended the trail, sunlight fractured through clouds, illuminating the ocean in shifting silver. Life had not become perfect. It had become honest. And honesty, though sometimes costly, offered a foundation sturdier than any illusion of permanence. The night my wife accepted a public invitation, I thought something ended irrevocably. In truth, something began, the reclamation of visibility not granted by others but claimed from within.